The wind howled through the trees as John and Emma stood frozen in the barn, the smell of decay thick in the air. In the dim light, Emma's hand trembled as she pointed to the far corner. There, half hidden under the straw, lay the lifeless body of one of their hens. Her feathers were torn, her eyes wide open in terror. But what made Emma's stomach drop was the unmistakable trail of blood leading from the bird, vanishing into the shadows. A rustling noise came from the corner, low and deliberate, as if something or someone was waiting. They weren't alone. The sound of wings flapping in the distance sent a chill down their spines. The falcons were closer than ever, and something far worse than they had imagined was watching them. Chapter 1: Morning Noise. The sun had just begun to rise over the hills surrounding the small town, casting soft golden light across the farm where John and Emma had lived for decades. It was their haven, a patch of earth they had nurtured with love and hard work. And now, as the early morning light painted the sky, it was time for the usual routine. John, with his weathered hands and slow, deliberate movements, stirred awake to the sound of birds chirping in the distance and the faint clucking of chickens in the coop. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to the peaceful sounds of the farm, the soft rustling of leaves in the trees, and the occasional snort of a pig from the nearby pen. Emma, his wife of many years, was already awake. She could never sleep in. It was part of the rhythm of their life, quiet mornings and steady work. "John, it's time," Emma called out softly from the kitchen. Her voice was gentle but firm, as it always had been. He groaned in response but pulled himself out of bed and slipped into his worn boots. The familiar chill of the early morning air brushed against his face as he stepped outside. Emma had already begun her rounds, tending to the chickens and checking on the pigs. John made his way toward the barn, the familiar sounds of the farm greeting him as he passed the rows of neatly kept vegetable beds and flower gardens. First on the list was the cows. John always took care of them first. The two old milk cows, Bessie and Clara, were waiting in their stalls, mooing softly. They had been with the couple for years, and both had become accustomed to John's presence. He gently patted their sides as he opened the barn door, allowing them to roam in the small paddock where they grazed peacefully on the fresh grass. Emma was already feeding the chickens and geese, tossing out handfuls of grain for them to peck at. Emma turned to John with a smile. "The pigs are fed, the geese are settled, and the garden's growing well," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was always a certain excitement in it when the farm was thriving. John nodded, and they moved on to the next task, cleaning the barn. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. They each grabbed a shovel, scooping out the soiled straw and replacing it with fresh bedding. They didn't mind the labor. It was the life they had chosen, a simple one, full of love for their animals and the land. As they worked, they spoke of their plans for the day. Emma was thinking about planting some more herbs in the garden. John was considering making some repairs to the fences, which had been slowly deteriorating over time. The farm had its challenges, but they worked together, and it always felt like the rhythm of life was just as it should be. Once the barn was clean and the animals settled for the moment, they moved to the ducks and geese. John had always enjoyed the antics of the ducks, the way they waddled around and quacked at anything that caught their attention. The geese were more serious, more regal, and they honked loudly as the couple approached. Emma filled their water trough, while John set out some fresh feed. The ducks, of course, immediately started splashing in the pond, making a mess of the water in their excitement. "Just like old times," John said with a chuckle, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. Emma smiled but didn't respond right away. She was more focused on the task, keeping an eye on the geese and ducks, making sure everything was in order. As they finished feeding the waterfowl, the peaceful morning suddenly took a turn. A loud, shrill screech split the air, echoing across the farm. John's head snapped up and Emma froze. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by the fluttering of wings. The noise was unmistakable. Falcons. John and Emma looked at each other, their faces pale. The falcons had been a problem in the past, but this was different. It sounded like there were more of them this time. Without another word, They both ran toward the chicken coop, hearts racing. The sight that met them was worse than they had imagined. A large group of falcons had swooped down from the trees, their sharp beaks and talons taking hold of the defenseless birds. The chickens, geese, and ducks were all in disarray, frantically running in every direction as the falcons swooped down to claim their prey. The shrieks of the birds filled the air as feathers flew everywhere. Emma screamed in panic, and John rushed forward, trying to wave his arms to scare off the attacking birds. But the falcons were relentless, darting around them with a speed that was impossible to match. In moments, a few geese had been taken, and several chickens lay injured on the ground. "Not again," John muttered, his voice filled with frustration and anger. This had happened before, but never to this extent. Emma was already at the coop, trying to herd the remaining birds to safety. She slammed the door shut behind her, trapping the survivors inside. John stood by, scanning the skies. The falcons seemed to be retreating, but he knew they would be back. "What can we do?" Emma said, her voice shaking. "They're too fast for us." John wiped his brow, his mind racing. He had dealt with falcons before, but never had they been this bold. And there were too many of them. They would need a plan. They couldn't just stand by and watch their farm be decimated by these predators. "We need to get rid of them," John said, determination in his voice. "We'll build traps, and we'll keep the animals closer to the barn from now on." Emma nodded, but the worry on her face didn't fade. The farm was vulnerable. The animals were at risk, and they had no idea why the falcons were behaving this way. As John began to think of ways to trap the falcons, Emma went back inside the house to gather her thoughts. She sat by the window, staring out at the farm, and wondered how many more times they would have to face this kind of attack. Meanwhile, John set to work gathering materials. He had an idea, a large net, some rope, and a few other supplies he could use to create a trap that might catch the falcons. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. The falcons were smart and they were fast. It would take careful planning, and even then, there was no guarantee. Back in the house, Emma was on the phone with the local ornithologist, hoping to get some advice. "We need help," she said urgently. "The falcons are taking our birds. Can you advise us on what to do?" The ornithologist, a woman named Clara, was sympathetic. "I've heard reports of falcons becoming more aggressive lately," Clara said. "It's not unusual for them to target small farms, especially when food is scarce. I can come out and take a look if you'd like. Perhaps we can find a way to coexist with them." John's mind raced with the possibilities. Coexisting with the falcons? Was that even possible? They couldn't let the birds take their animals. But at the same time, they didn't want to harm the falcons. "We'll be waiting," Emma said, hanging up the phone. The day had started out so peaceful, but now, as the falcons began to circle overhead, their quiet farm had become a battlefield. And as John and Emma worked together to come up with a plan, the falcons returned again, this time under the cover of darkness. Another challenge was about to begin, and it would test everything they knew about life on the farm. Chapter 2, A New Threat. The next morning, after a restless night of listening to the falcons' sharp cries echo through the darkness, John and Emma were up early. The usual calm of their farm had been shattered, and a sense of unease hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. As they stepped outside, the evidence of the previous day's attack was still fresh. Feathers were scattered across the yard, and the few remaining geese and ducks huddled together nervously in their pen, their eyes darting toward the trees. "I don't like the look of this, John," Emma said, her voice filled with concern as she watched the birds. "They're getting bolder." John nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the sky. The falcons hadn't come in the early hours as they had the day before, but he knew they were out there, watching. The attack had been swift and violent, and there was no sign that the falcons were going to back off. The couple went about their usual routine, trying to get a sense of normalcy back, but every time they looked up, the faint shadow of a falcon passed overhead. It was as though the birds were patrolling the skies, waiting for the moment to strike again. John decided to work on the traps he had begun building the previous day. They were crude but effective, nets strung between trees and camouflaged in the bushes, But when he tried one of them, the falcons seemed to avoid them completely. "They're too smart for this?" John muttered under his breath, frustration creeping into his voice. Emma had been keeping a watchful eye on the barn, making sure the cows and pigs were safe from the aerial threat. But as she walked toward the chicken coop to check on the hens, something caught her attention. On the ground, near the edge of the pen, was a strange, faint mark, almost like a paw print, but much too large for any animal they knew. Her heart skipped a beat as she bent down to examine it. The soil around the print was disturbed, and there was a strange odor, almost metallic. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, but there was no sign of any creature. "John," she called, her voice a little shaky. John appeared beside her in an instant, his eyes narrowing as he crouched beside her. "What do you think this is?" "It's not animal," Emma said slowly. "It's something else." She stood up, brushing the dirt off her hands. "It doesn't feel right." John looked around the farm, his instincts telling him that something more was at play here. The falcons weren't the only danger. Whatever had left that strange print seemed to be watching them. The day passed uneventfully, but as evening began to fall, the tension in the air thickened. They had just finished feeding the animals and were sitting on the porch, drinking tea, when Emma noticed something else. One of the hens, which had seemed perfectly fine earlier in the day, was now stumbling around the pen, feathers scattered across the ground. It was losing more feathers by the minute, and Emma's heart sank. "Not again," she muttered, rushing toward the hen. John followed her, his brow furrowed. "That's not normal. It's as if something's attacking it again, but this time, it's different." Emma carefully picked up the hen, cradling it in her hands. The bird was weak, its wings shaking. "It's losing feathers. The falcons couldn't have done this so quickly, could they?" John shook his head. "No, it doesn't make sense." Emma stood there, holding the hen, as John scanned the pen and the surrounding area. He was beginning to realize that whatever was going on, it was more than just the falcons. There was something deeper at play here, something that didn't add up. The falcons might have attacked, but they weren't responsible for this. "Maybe we need to get the vet back out here," Emma suggested, but there was doubt in her voice. The previous experience with the trainee had left her wary of trusting anyone again. "We'll try the traps again first," John said, his voice determined. "I'll finish the ones we started yesterday, and we'll see if that helps." But as he moved to gather more materials, the day began to fade into dusk, and Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. A shadow moved at the edge of the trees. She caught a glimpse of it before it disappeared. It was gone before she could be sure, but something inside her told her that they weren't alone. Later that evening, after dinner, John and Emma sat at the kitchen table, the weight of the day pressing heavily on them. The farm, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a place of lurking danger. Emma stared out the window, her thoughts racing. She hadn't mentioned the shadow she had seen by the trees, but the unease was growing. Whatever was happening wasn't just an issue with the falcons. There was something or someone out there. And then, as if answering her unspoken thoughts, there was a knock at the door. John stood up immediately, his hand instinctively moving to the knife on the counter. Emma followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. Who would be visiting at this hour? When John opened the door, he was met by a man he didn't recognize. The stranger was tall, with dark hair and a rugged appearance. He wore a weathered jacket and boots, and his eyes were sharp, scanning the area around them before landing on John. "I hear you're having trouble with the falcons," the man said, his voice low but confident. John raised an eyebrow. "Who are you?" "I'm Simon," the man replied. "I specialize in falcon control. I've dealt with situations like this before." Emma stepped forward, her eyes narrowed. "We've tried everything," she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. "How do we know we can trust you?" Simon seemed unfazed by her questioning. "You don't know me, but I know you're in trouble. I've been keeping an eye on your farm. You've got a serious issue with those falcons, and I can help." John exchanged a glance with Emma. Something about this man didn't sit right with him. but they were desperate. If there was any chance he could help, they needed to take it. "Come inside," John said, stepping aside to let Simon in. The man entered, and they all sat down around the table. "What exactly is it you do?" John asked, his voice steady. "I use a combination of methods to control falcon populations," Simon replied, his eyes glinting. "You see, falcons are very territorial, and they're only aggressive when they feel threatened. I can help calm them down." Emma wasn't sure what to think. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Simon smiled, but there was something unsettling about it. "I have my ways. You just have to trust me." As he spoke, Emma's unease grew. This man was promising answers, but his methods felt unclear, almost cryptic. John and Emma exchanged a look. They were running out of options, but there was something strange about Simon's confidence. Could he really help them? Or was he hiding something even darker? The night grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer as Simon explained his methods. But despite his assurances, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to invite a new kind of danger into their lives. Chapter 3: A Mysterious Visitor. Simon sat across from John and Emma, his sharp eyes never leaving them as he explained his unusual methods for dealing with falcons. The room, dimly lit by the flickering kitchen light, seemed to close in on them as his words hung in the air. Emma, still uneasy, listened closely, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "Falcons are territorial," Simon began, his voice steady and calm. "They won't attack if they feel their territory is secure. The key is to show them that they have no reason to fear you, and to make the farm less inviting. I use a combination of sound deterrents, reflective surfaces, and scent markers to unsettle them. It won't harm them, but it will make them think twice about coming back." John leaned forward, his skepticism evident. "And you think this will work?" Simon nodded, his expression serious. "I've done this before. It's not instant, but it's effective. The falcons will leave and they'll stay away. But you'll need to be patient." Emma exchanged a glance with John. They had tried everything else. They had no choice but to give it a shot. If Simon's methods worked, it would mean the difference between saving their animals and losing everything. But something about the man's confidence unsettled her. It was as if he knew too much. "All right," John said after a moment, standing up. "We'll give it a try. But if this doesn't work, we'll need to find another solution." Simon smiled, the corners of his mouth curling upward. "Trust me, you won't need another solution." That night, as darkness descended over the farm, John and Emma set about preparing the farm for Simon's method. They strung up reflective tapes along the perimeter of the property, hung shiny metal objects from the trees, and placed a few strategically positioned scent markers around the barn. The whole setup felt strange to Emma, like some kind of makeshift scarecrow designed to ward off an invisible enemy. As they worked, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The eerie quiet of the night seemed to press in on them, and every rustle of leaves made her heart race. But they finished setting up just before midnight, and John stood back to survey their work. "Let's hope this works," Emma murmured, more to herself than to John. John nodded. "It has to." They retreated into the house, locking the door behind them. The night passed slowly, the silence punctuated only by the occasional rustling of the wind. But just as Emma was beginning to feel a sense of calm settle over the house, the shrill call of a falcon broke through the stillness, sharp and unmistakable. "Here they come," John muttered, standing up. Emma grabbed his arm as they hurried to the window, hearts pounding in their chests. The falcons were back, just as Simon had warned them. But this time they weren't alone. The number of birds in the sky had increased dramatically, the dark silhouettes cutting through the air like sharp shadows. They circled overhead, swooping down toward the farm with terrifying precision. John grabbed his rifle and rushed out the door, Emma following close behind. The falcons were targeting the geese first, their sharp talons flashing in the moonlight as they made their attack. John shouted to scare them away, but the birds seemed undeterred, growing more aggressive with each passing second. "John, look!" Emma cried, pointing toward the barn. Something was different this time. A figure stood by the barn, moving quickly in the shadows. It was Simon, his form outlined by the faint glow of the reflective tapes they had hung earlier. But something was wrong. He wasn't using any of the tools he had mentioned. He was simply standing there, watching. "Simon!" John yelled, running toward him. But when he reached the spot where the man had stood, there was no sign of him. The night air was thick with tension, and Emma's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the darkness. "He was here," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "He was here just a moment ago." But there was no trace of Simon. The farm was silent again, save for the flapping of wings as the falcons retreated. They had managed to drive them off, but the damage had been done. Several geese lay on the ground, feathers scattered around them. "Where did he go?" Emma asked, her voice shaking with confusion. John shook his head, his brow furrowed. "I don't know, but this doesn't feel right." They spent the next few hours checking on the animals, making sure there were no more casualties. The falcons had retreated for the moment, but the feeling of unease lingered in the air. When they finally returned to the house, Emma noticed something strange. There were feather tracks leading from the barn toward the woods, but they weren't like any tracks she had seen before. The feathers were larger than those of a falcon, and they seemed to be concentrated in a specific area. "Look at this," Emma said, her voice quiet but full of dread. John knelt beside the tracks, studying them carefully. "These aren't just falcon feathers. These are something else." As they followed the tracks, they led them deeper into the woods, toward the edge of the property. The tracks were strange and deliberate, as if something had been moving through the area with purpose. And at the end of the trail, they found something even more unsettling. A pile of feathers, carefully arranged in a circle. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she recognized something among the feathers. It was a broken piece of one of Simon's reflective tapes, twisted and torn, lying at the center of the pile. "What is this?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling with fear. John stood up slowly, his face pale. "I don't know, Emma, but I think we've just found a clue to something bigger than we ever imagined." As they stared at the strange scene before them, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Whoever or whatever had left those tracks was still out there, and they weren't finished with the farm just yet. Chapter 4: The Poisoning of the Cow. The morning light barely broke through the mist when Emma made her way to the barn to check on the animals. The farm was quiet, almost too quiet, and a heavy fog hung over the fields. As she passed the cow's pen, something felt off. One of the cows, a large brown one named Daisy, was standing alone in the corner of the pen, her head low and her movements sluggish. "John," Emma called, a note of concern in her voice as she peered through the wooden slats of the fence. "Something's wrong with Daisy." John, who had been fixing a gate nearby, looked up at the sound of her voice. He walked over to the pen with a slow, deliberate pace, his eyes already scanning the animal. Daisy had always been a strong, healthy cow, and Emma's concern wasn't misplaced. John reached the gate and pushed it open, walking cautiously toward the cow. "What's going on, girl?" he muttered, inspecting her closely. Daisy's usually bright eyes were dull, and her breathing seemed shallow. She let out a low, hoarse moo but didn't try to move when John gently stroked her side. Emma watched from the fence, worry knitting her brow. "She doesn't look right, John. She's sick." John crouched down, feeling Daisy's sides. She was warm to the touch, but not excessively so. Her breathing was labored, and there was an odd smell in the air, something faint but unmistakable. Could she have eaten something bad? John asked, standing up and looking around the field. Emma nodded slowly. "I've been watching her, and she's been grazing near that patch of tall grass by the creek. Could be something there, I don't know." John's face hardened as he looked over at the patch of grass Emma had mentioned. The area near the creek had always been lush, but in recent days the weeds had begun to grow unusually tall, almost unnaturally so. He remembered noticing a strange, dark discoloration in the blades of grass as he passed by a few days ago but hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now he wasn't so sure. "I'll go check it out," John said, turning toward the pasture. He took one last glance at Daisy, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Something wasn't right. As John made his way to the creek, Emma stayed behind to keep an eye on Daisy. She walked slowly around the pen, her gaze never leaving the cow. Daisy had always been one of their healthiest animals, and to see her so weak and disoriented sent a shiver of dread through Emma's heart. John knelt beside the patch of grass, brushing aside the weeds to reveal the thick green blades beneath. He noticed the same dark discoloration that had caught his eye before, now much more pronounced. His fingers brushed against one of the blades, and he recoiled slightly. There was a strange, almost oily residue on the grass, something that didn't belong. Poison, he muttered to himself, his gut tightening. This is what's making her sick. Emma, still in the pen with Daisy, looked over at John, who was now standing, looking around the field. She could see the realization settle over his face. The faint smell from earlier was beginning to make sense. Whatever Daisy had eaten, it wasn't just ordinary grass. "We need to get a vet out here," Emma called to him, her voice urgent. John nodded, but the unease was evident in his eyes. He knew their local veterinarian, Dr. Harper, was always swamped, especially this time of year. But there was no time to waste. "I'll give her a call," John said, heading back toward the house. But as he reached the front porch, his heart sank. The phone was out of service. He had checked it earlier that morning and everything seemed fine, but now it wouldn't dial out. "That's just great," he muttered under his breath, frustration building. The situation was growing worse by the minute, and he had no way of contacting Dr. Harper. Emma, who had been watching from the barn, came up to him with a grim look on her face. "What are we going to do?" "I'm going to call again," John said, trying to stay calm, though his voice was tight with worry. "But I don't think it'll go through." Just then, the phone rang. Emma froze. "John, the phone." John dashed inside to answer it, his heart pounding in his chest. When he picked up, a voice on the other end spoke quickly, cutting through the static. "This is Dr. Harper's office," the voice said. "I'm afraid Dr. Harper is out of town for the day, but we have a trainee, Chris, who can come out. He's inexperienced, but he'll do his best." John hesitated. A trainee? With Daisy's condition worsening by the minute, he didn't have time for inexperience. But they had no other options. He agreed reluctantly, hoping that whatever this young man lacked in skill, he made up for in enthusiasm. An hour later, Chris arrived. He was a young man, not much older than Emma's grandchildren, and he looked as nervous as John had expected. He was carrying a small black bag, and as he walked up to the barn, he seemed unsure of himself. "I've never treated a cow before," Chris admitted, looking at John and Emma with wide eyes. "But I've read the books, and I know the basics." John's skepticism deepened. He nodded curtly. "Let's just get this over with." Chris set to work, taking Daisy's temperature and checking her vital signs. He was methodical, but there was a hesitation in his every move, and Emma could see that he lacked the confidence needed for a situation like this. After several minutes of checking, Chris finally stood back and scratched his head. "It's hard to say for sure," he said, his voice uncertain. "But she looks like she's been poisoned by something. Maybe the grass, but I can't be certain. I'd recommend we give her a mild sedative to calm her down and wait for Dr. Harper to come back. She'll know what to do." John's patience snapped. "That's it? You don't know what's causing it, and you want to sedate her?" Chris recoiled slightly, sensing the anger in John's voice. "I'm sorry, but I'm just not equipped to handle this kind of thing. I can't do anything more." Emma stepped forward, her own frustration bubbling to the surface. "We can't just wait. We need to do something now." John's eyes darkened. The feeling of helplessness gnawed at him. They couldn't afford to wait for Dr. Harper, not with Daisy's life hanging in the balance. "We'll take care of it ourselves," John said, his voice firm. "We can't trust this boy. We'll figure it out." As Chris reluctantly left, Emma and John exchanged a look, knowing that they had no choice but to take matters into their own hands. They would find the right solution even if they had to do it themselves. That night, as Daisy lay in the barn, her breathing shallow and her eyes unfocused, Emma watched over her in the dim light. Something wasn't right. The cow's symptoms seemed to be worsening, and the faint, oily residue from the grass kept haunting Emma's thoughts. She had no idea what they were up against. But whatever it wasn't just the poison that had been left behind on the grass. It was something much darker, something that was connected to everything happening on the farm, something that Emma and John hadn't even begun to understand yet. As she sat beside Daisy, Emma noticed a strange twitch in the cow's leg, and her heart skipped a beat. Daisy's eyes opened wide, and she let out a low, pained moo. The cow was changing, and Emma knew that they were running out of time. Chapter 5: Life and Death on the Farm. The air was thick with tension in the barn as Emma and John hovered over Daisy, who lay motionless on the straw-covered floor. The evening light filtered weakly through the small window, casting long shadows across the barn. The cow's breathing was shallow, and the once vibrant brown coat was now dull and matted with sweat. Her once strong and confident frame had become a fragile, trembling shell. John stood over Daisy, a concerned look etched deeply into his face. "We can't just wait for that boy's advice to work. We have to do something." Emma nodded, her heart heavy. The young trainee had made his attempt, but it had been too little, too late. They couldn't just sit idly by and watch Daisy fade away. She had been their dependable, hard-working cow for years. She was more than just an animal to them. She was a part of their family. "Do you think the herbs will work?" Emma asked, her voice tight with worry as she set a small jar of dried herbs on the wooden bench beside John. He had told her that these could help stabilize Daisy's condition, that they might counteract the poison, but Emma wasn't sure. She felt desperate. Their options were limited. "I don't know," John admitted, his hands shaking as he measured out a small spoonful of the dried leaves. "But it's worth a shot. We've used these herbs before, for smaller things. Nothing like this, but if we're going to try anything, this might help." They mixed the herbs with warm water, creating a makeshift tea to try to settle Daisy's stomach and calm her symptoms. Emma held the cup gently to Daisy's lips, speaking to her softly as if the cow could understand. "You'll be all right, girl. We're not going to let you go," Emma murmured, her voice shaking with emotion. It wasn't much, but it was all they could do. For hours, Emma and John sat by Daisy's side, repeating the process and watching her closely. Daisy's eyes remained dull, and her breathing was still slow, but Emma noticed a slight change. The twitching in her legs had lessened, and her ears seemed to flicker occasionally as if she was trying to respond. It was a small sign, but it gave them hope. Just as they were starting to feel the first flickers of optimism, the barn door creaked open. Emma looked up sharply, her heart jumping in her chest. She hadn't expected anyone else to arrive, especially not this late. The door swung open fully, revealing a tall, older man in a dark coat, carrying a medical bag. He was followed by a younger woman, who seemed to be nervously glancing around. "Good evening," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Dr. Parker. I understand you've got a cow in trouble." Emma breathed a sigh of relief. This was what they needed, a professional. She stood up quickly to greet him, her face full of gratitude. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We've been doing everything we can, but—" Dr. Parker raised a hand, cutting her off gently. "I've heard, and I've spoken to Dr. Harper. I understand there were some complications earlier. Let's see what we're dealing with." He approached Daisy, setting down his medical bag and pulling out a stethoscope. Emma and John watched anxiously as Dr. Parker examined the cow, his expression thoughtful as he checked Daisy's heart and lungs, gently prodding her swollen stomach. "So, what's the verdict?" John asked after a tense moment. Dr. Parker stood up, shaking his head slightly. "The young man who came earlier, he made a mistake in his diagnosis. He misjudged the severity of the poisoning. But don't worry, I'll correct that. We've got this." Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her as Dr. Parker's skilled hands worked. The man seemed to know what he was doing, and the clarity in his eyes gave them hope that Daisy's chances of survival had just improved. "Can you save her?" Emma asked softly. "We'll do everything we can," Dr. Parker replied, his tone serious but reassuring. The next 24 hours are critical. Her body needs time to expel the toxins, and we'll help her with that. But there's a chance she might make it. As the evening passed, Dr. Parker administered an antidote and some fluids to keep Daisy hydrated. The cow's condition began to stabilize slowly, though she remained weak. Emma and John stayed by her side through the night, refusing to leave the barn. They took turns checking on Daisy, holding her head, and speaking words of encouragement into the dim silence of the barn. Hours turned into long, quiet moments, where only the sound of the wind outside and Daisy's labored breathing broke the stillness. At one point, Emma's eyes closed, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to her. But she couldn't sleep, not fully. She could still hear Daisy's every breath, the sounds of her hooves shifting weakly in the straw. As the night wore on, a slight change occurred. Daisy's breathing became a little deeper, and Emma noticed that the cow was blinking more frequently, as though she was trying to focus on the faces of the people around her. "John," Emma whispered, her voice soft with cautious hope. "Do you think she's waking up?" John leaned closer, staring down at Daisy. Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in hours, Emma saw a glimmer of life there, a tiny flicker that made her heart race with joy. "She's trying," John said quietly, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "She's not done yet." As the hours passed and the first rays of dawn began to peek through the barn window, Daisy's condition showed further signs of improvement. She still looked weak, and her body trembled slightly, but her eyes were alert, and she was no longer unresponsive. Emma carefully fed her another spoonful of the herbal mixture, and this time Daisy seemed to take it without hesitation. "We might make it through this," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse but full of emotion. Dr. Parker had left them for the night, but he promised to return in the morning to check on Daisy again. John and Emma stayed at her side, watching her closely. They didn't dare go inside, fearing that if they left, Daisy might worsen again. By the time the sun rose fully, casting a soft glow over the fields outside the barn, Daisy was showing signs of true recovery. Her breathing was more even, and she was able to lift her head slightly. But despite the progress, Emma knew they weren't out of the woods yet. Daisy had come so far, but the next few days would tell the real story. As the day stretched on, Emma felt a deep sense of relief wash over her. Daisy was still with them, and she had fought through the worst of it. But as Emma stroked the cow's coat, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not quite done with their struggles on the farm. Would Daisy fully recover? Would they ever be able to put the dangers of the farm behind them? Only time would tell. But for now, they had their answer. Daisy had survived. And that, in itself, was a victory. Chapter 6. Falcon Attack. The nights had grown eerily quiet since Daisy's recovery, the occasional rustle of wind and the distant calls of the barnyard animals filling the air. But that sense of calm was shattered once again. The first sign came late in the evening, as Emma and John sat in the living room, the glow from the fireplace casting flickering shadows against the walls. A sharp, piercing screech echoed from the direction of the barnyard, followed by the unmistakable sound of feathers cutting through the air. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She stood up instantly, the familiar sense of dread creeping back over her. "John, they're back." Emma's voice trembled as she hurried toward the door. Her mind raced with fear, her thoughts flashing back to the previous Falcon attacks. The terror, the panic, the helplessness. John was already at the door, his face set in determination. "We've got to stop them before they take any more of the birds," he said, his voice low and firm. The tension in his words was palpable, a reminder of the devastation the Falcons had caused in the past. The couple moved quickly, stepping into the cool night air, their feet crunching on the gravel path leading to the barnyard. As they reached the first corner of their property, they could hear the frenzied squawks of their remaining chickens and geese, now huddled together in the corner of the coop. The Falcons were back, and this time, it seemed as though they were more relentless than ever. John reached into the shed for the tools he had prepared. He had been working all day, constructing new traps designed to outsmart the elusive predators. The old traps hadn't worked. The Falcons had become too clever, dodging and flying off at the last second. But this time, John had thought of something different, something they could use to catch the birds in a way they wouldn't expect. Emma took a deep breath, her heart hammering in her chest. "Be careful," she whispered, her voice full of concern. "We don't know how many of them there are now." John nodded. "I know. Stay close." They moved silently across the property, glancing up to the darkened sky above. It was difficult to see, but Emma could swear she noticed the silhouettes of birds circling overhead, more than she had seen before. It was as if the falcons had grown bolder, perhaps sensing that they could terrorize the farm once again with impunity. As they neared the coop, Emma's breath caught. The flock was larger than before, maybe double the size of the one that had attacked the first time. The birds swooped in, diving low and fast, their talons outstretched as they snatched at the birds. "John!" Emma cried, her voice breaking with panic. "There are too many of them." John's face hardened, his jaw set in frustration. He knew they couldn't fight them off manually. Their only option now was to trap them. But the birds were fast, unpredictable, and relentless. "We've got to make this work," John muttered as he crouched low, setting the trap carefully beneath the cover of darkness. The last thing they needed was for the falcons to see the trap before it was sprung. He placed several baited areas designed to lure the birds in closer, all while Emma kept watch. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity as they waited. Then suddenly the falcons broke off their attack. They hovered high above the barnyard for a moment, almost as though they were scanning the area, and then, as though in perfect synchronization, they dove down toward the bait. "Now!" John hissed. With swift movements, John pulled the lever, and the trap snapped shut, its netting ensnaring several of the falcons in one swift motion. But as the birds flailed, struggling against their confinement, Emma noticed something that made her freeze. One of the falcons, its wings flapping erratically, was not caught in the trap. Instead, it had been injured. Its left wing was bent at an odd angle, and it seemed to be having difficulty flying. It struggled on the ground, its movements slow and disoriented. Emma's heart softened with pity. "John, that one's hurt," she said quietly, pointing to the injured bird. "We can't just leave it like this." John turned his head to look. His expression was one of conflicted hesitation. "It's dangerous, Emma. If we let it go, it could come back. It might attack again." "I know, but look at it," Emma said. She felt a surge of compassion. "It's hurt. We can't just let it suffer." John exhaled slowly, clearly torn. "What do you propose we do?" Emma took a step forward, her eyes never leaving the falcon. "We catch it. We treat its wing, and maybe it'll be able to fly again. If we help it, maybe it will leave us alone." John was silent for a moment, his face etched with worry. The falcon could easily turn on them once it was healed, if they even could heal it. But deep down, he knew Emma was right. They couldn't let an injured animal suffer just because it had been a threat. The idea of treating the bird, even though it could mean more danger in the future, seemed like the only humane choice. "All right," John finally agreed, his voice resigned but understanding. "But we need to be careful. If it's going to work, we'll have to move fast." Together, they carefully approached the struggling falcon. It hissed, its beak snapping in their direction, but the injury to its wing made it weak and slow. Emma moved with gentle precision, reaching out to grab hold of its body, while John carefully examined its wing, making sure not to hurt it further. "This isn't going to be easy," Emma murmured as she worked. She glanced back at John, who was focused on assessing the injury. "We'll need to get it into the barn," John said, his voice calm but firm. "There's no way we can treat it out here." The falcon, still weak from its injuries, was carefully placed into a box that Emma lined with soft straw. It struggled slightly but didn't try to escape, too exhausted to fight back. They carried the box together, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what it could mean. As they reached the barn, Emma whispered, "If we heal it, maybe it will help us. Maybe it won't come back." "I hope so," John said quietly, his brow furrowed. "But we're gambling with a lot right now." Once they set the box down, they moved to prepare everything they needed to treat the bird. But even as they worked, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something else was coming, that the real danger was still just beyond the horizon. Intriguing ending. As Emma carefully bandaged the falcon's wing, she noticed something in the corner of her eye. A shadow moved swiftly across the barn's entrance. Someone or something was watching them. Chapter 7. A trap for the falcons. The following days were filled with the quiet yet pressing urgency of dealing with the falcon problem. John and Emma had built several more traps, using a combination of their knowledge and the trial and error from the last raid. This time, they knew they had to be cleverer, more strategic. The falcons had grown accustomed to their methods, which meant they had to outwit them once again. The traps were set strategically around the perimeter of the barnyard, baited with pieces of fresh meat to draw in the predators. Emma spent hours in the garden, collecting herbs and flowers, while John worked on the structure of the traps, reinforcing them with stronger nets. They had no choice but to outlast the falcons, using the birds' natural instincts against them. Despite their best efforts, the falcons didn't take the bait at first. They circled the traps, darting in and out of their reach. Emma could feel the weight of her frustration as she stood in the yard, watching them soar through the air, always just out of reach. They were smarter than she had given them credit for. "We need to be patient," John said, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "They'll make a mistake. They always do." But the patience was wearing thin. The couple was growing desperate, the attack of the previous weeks still fresh in their minds. The fate of their animals rested on these traps working. Then, on the fourth day after setting the traps, they had their first success. One of the falcons, distracted by the scent of the bait, swooped in and triggered one of the traps. The net closed tightly around its body, and the bird struggled, its wings flapping violently against the confines of the trap. Emma and John rushed over to the spot, their hearts racing with a mixture of excitement and concern. "It worked," Emma whispered, her voice trembling as she approached the struggling falcon. John crouched down, his eyes carefully examining the bird. Its wings were still intact, but its talons were caught in the net, and it had twisted awkwardly in the trap. "We've got to help it," Emma said, stepping closer to the falcon, her voice filled with the same compassion that had led them to catch the injured one before. John hesitated. "We can't afford to let our guard down. It could attack again once it's free." "I know," Emma said quietly, "but if we don't treat it, we're just adding to the cycle of suffering. Maybe it'll leave us alone once it's healed." John's gaze softened. Despite his reservations, he knew his wife was right. The time had come to make a choice. Together, they carefully freed the falcon from the net, making sure not to cause it further injury. Its eyes blinked rapidly, adjusting to the light. For a moment, it seemed stunned, disoriented, but the falcon quickly regained its composure. It was clear it was a strong bird, built for survival, yet still wary of the humans who had trapped it. Emma gently cradled the bird in her hands, moving with tenderness as she checked its wings for any injuries. "We need to treat it," she said, looking at John for confirmation. "All right," John agreed, his voice reluctant but resolute. "But we'll keep it confined for now. We don't want to risk it flying off and coming back again." They brought the falcon inside the barn, placing it in a large cage that Emma had prepared earlier. It was a simple space, but it was enough to keep the bird contained while they tended to its needs. John set to work immediately, using a few old remedies he had learned from years of farming. They carefully examined the bird's feathers, cleaned any dirt from its talons, and wrapped the bird's wings in a soft cloth. It was a delicate process, but after some time, the falcon calmed, its sharp gaze softening just slightly. "This is crazy, Emma," John muttered as he worked. "We've got a dangerous predator right here, and we're treating it like a pet." Emma smiled softly, her eyes never leaving the bird. "It's not just about the danger, John. It's about what we believe in. We can't just trap them and kill them. We need to understand them, find a way to live alongside them." John sighed, setting down the cloth he had been using. He ran a hand over his tired face, his frustration evident. "I don't know if I can live alongside something that keeps trying to kill my chickens." "I know," Emma said gently, But maybe we can find a solution without hurting it. Maybe we can help it heal, and in return, it won't come back. John didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched the falcon in silence, wondering if Emma's belief in compassion was misplaced. He had spent his life working the land, solving problems with hard, practical methods. But maybe, just maybe, this time there was another way. The days passed, and the falcon's condition improved. Slowly but surely, the bird regained its strength. It no longer struggled in the cage, but instead watched John and Emma with those sharp, calculating eyes. They fed it carefully, keeping it as comfortable as they could, but always maintaining a cautious distance. It was when the falcon's wings were fully healed that Emma and John made the decision. It was time to release the bird back into the wild. "It's ready," Emma said one morning as she checked the bird's wings for the last time. "It's strong enough to fly now." John nodded, his emotions mixed. "All right, let's do it." They took the falcon outside, the crisp morning air filling their lungs. The barnyard was still, the usual sounds of the animals low in the background. The falcon perched on Emma's outstretched arm, its talons gripping gently but firmly. For a moment, they stood there in silence, both of them filled with the weight of the decision they had made. John wasn't sure if this was the right thing, but Emma had been right all along. If they had the power to help, they had to try. "Go on, then," Emma whispered, her voice full of warmth. "You're free." With a powerful flap of its wings, the falcon soared into the air, the breeze carrying it higher and higher, until it was just a speck in the sky. Emma watched it fly, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sadness. She had done what she believed was right. But would the falcon ever truly leave them alone? As they turned to walk back inside, a strange sensation passed over Emma. She looked down at the ground and noticed something unusual. A faint, almost imperceptible mark was left on the dirt, a series of lines that seemed to form a pattern. John noticed it too and bent down to inspect it. "What's this?" he muttered, his voice low. Emma stared at the mark. It was too neat, too deliberate to be a natural occurrence. Something about it felt wrong. Intriguing ending. As the falcon disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind an unexplainable mark, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their troubles. Something deeper, something more unsettling, was unfolding. Chapter 8. Awaited help. The days that followed their release of the falcon were filled with a sense of cautious hope. Emma and John had done everything they could to protect their animals, and for a time, the skies seemed to be clear of any new threats. The tension that had gripped their farm for weeks began to ease, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was just waiting to disrupt their fragile peace. The quiet began to break when a few local residents, who had heard of the couple's struggles with the falcons, offered to help. At first, it had been small gestures, just a few neighbors bringing food for the animals or offering their advice. But now, with the full scale of the falcon problem looming over them, the community began to rally together. "We've got to look out for each other," one of the neighbors, George, said, as he and his son arrived early one morning to help secure the barn. "If these falcons can't be kept at bay, we all might lose something." The presence of others felt like a small but comforting support. People brought stronger fencing, reinforced traps, and even a few scarecrow designs that they thought might help. Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as the farm slowly began to take on a more fortified, collective form. It was no longer just John and her against the world. But just as they were beginning to feel some semblance of security, Emma learned of an unexpected development. One morning, when John was out with the animals, she received a phone call from the local authorities, something that made her stomach turn. A farm inspection might be coming soon, the voice on the other end of the line said. "You'll need to be ready, especially with everything that's been happening. They'll want to see how you're handling the falcon issue and whether it's safe to keep your animals." Emma's mind raced as she hung up the phone. The inspection wasn't due for another few days, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The pressure of the falcon attacks had already stretched their resources thin. Now, with the possibility of losing their animals if they weren't deemed up to code, the stakes had grown even higher. John arrived just as Emma was mulling over this new problem. He could see the concern written across her face. "What is it, Emma?" "They're sending inspectors," she said, her voice tight. "They want to check if everything's safe." John ran a hand through his hair, his face setting into a grim expression. "We'll be ready. We have to be." As the couple began preparing for the inspection, a sudden storm rolled in. Dark clouds gathered in the sky, and within an hour, rain poured down in sheets, the wind howling through the trees. The storm was so fierce that it felt as though the world itself was trying to tear everything apart. The animals grew restless, and Emma could hear the frantic clucking of the chickens and the anxious sounds of the cows. John was already outside, trying to keep the barn doors from being blown off their hinges. He shouted over the roar of the wind, "Get the animals inside! We need to keep them dry!" Emma rushed to the barn, her heart pounding in her chest. They had worked so hard to make everything secure, and now the storm threatened to undo it all. The rain made the barnyard a treacherous mess, and she could feel the weight of the pressure bearing down on her. There was no time for a break. Not now. She needed to get the animals into shelter, and fast. Together, John and Emma moved quickly, gathering the goats and the chickens and bringing them inside the barn. The cows, startled by the wind, were difficult to manage, but with a few sharp commands, they managed to herd them into the larger shelter at the back. It was a chaotic, exhausting process, but they finally got everyone inside and sheltered from the worst of the storm. "I think we've got everything," John said, taking a deep breath as he wiped the rain from his face. "But this storm isn't going to make the inspection any easier." Emma nodded, her thoughts racing. They had done their best, but now they needed to make sure everything was in order, and quickly. The rain continued to batter the roof, and every creak of the barn seemed to echo through the night. As the storm raged on, Emma sat with the animals, trying to keep them calm. She couldn't help but notice that the injured falcon, now fully healed and released, was nowhere to be found. Had it flown away, or was it somewhere close, watching them again? Then, just as the storm began to subside, a familiar sight caught Emma's eye. There, standing just outside the barn in the fading light of the storm, was the injured falcon. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, just a few paces away, was another bird. This one was larger, more menacing, and it seemed to be watching them with a knowing, predatory gaze. The injured bird, still carrying the mark of their healing touch, had returned. But this time it was not alone. The falcon stood motionless, as if waiting for something, and something about its posture, its stillness, sent a shiver down Emma's spine. "John," Emma called out softly, her voice trembling. "It's back, but there's something different about it this time." John turned and saw the two birds standing just outside the barn. He froze, his eyes narrowing. The wind had died down, but the weight of the moment was not lost on him. They had helped this bird once, but now it felt like it was hiding something from them. What had it been leading to, and why had it returned? Intriguing ending. As the bird stood motionless in the distance, Emma noticed something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. A glint of metal from beneath the larger bird's feathers. Hidden away, yet unmistakable. Chapter 9. Secrets Underneath. The morning after the storm, a lingering unease hung over the farm. The birds that had caused them so much trouble were still out there, watching from the trees, their eyes gleaming in the early light. Emma and John knew they couldn't ignore the mystery of the injured falcon any longer. The bird had come back, and its strange companion had raised more questions than answers. But there was something about the way the falcon had watched them, something different from before. "Let's get to the bottom of this," John muttered, more to himself than to Emma as he grabbed a pair of binoculars from the shed. Emma nodded, her expression grave. She had noticed the glint of metal beneath the larger bird's feathers the night before, and the thought of it kept gnawing at her. What was hidden there? Was it something dangerous? Or was it a clue that might lead them to understand what was truly happening with the falcons? They moved carefully toward the edge of the farm, eyes trained on the birds perched high in the trees. John held the binoculars steady, his hands steady despite the nagging uncertainty that had crept into his chest. "That one. Do you see it?" Emma whispered, pointing to the larger falcon. The bird seemed almost too still, too perfectly poised, as if it were waiting for something. John peered through the binoculars, focusing on the bird's underbelly. I see it. It's got something attached to it, like a small metal tag or... Before John could finish his sentence, the injured falcon that had been with the larger one suddenly flew down to the ground, landing with a light thud just a few yards away. It hopped a little closer to them, as if beckoning them forward. The moment felt eerie, like they were being drawn into something they didn't fully understand. Emma was the first to step forward. I think it wants us to follow. John hesitated for a moment before following her, their boots crunching on the gravel path. They walked slowly, making sure not to alarm the birds. The injured falcon hopped a little further down the path, its wings fluttering with an air of urgency. Emma could feel a strange sense of anticipation building in her chest. Something was about to be revealed, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was going to be something important. As they neared the spot where the falcons had landed, Emma's eyes caught something that made her stop dead in her tracks. Beneath the foliage, partially obscured by dirt and leaves, was a small metal device. It gleamed under the light, almost as if it had been placed there deliberately. John bent down to inspect it, brushing away the dirt. The device appeared to be a small transmitter, one that seemed strangely out of place in the natural world of their farm. The idea that this could have been deliberately placed by someone made Emma shiver. She looked up at John, her heart racing. This isn't just a falcon problem, Emma said quietly, her voice filled with dread. There's something else going on here. John nodded grimly. It's connected to the birds, all right? But why? They were interrupted by a sudden rustling noise behind them. The large falcon had flown down, landing on the ground just a few feet away. Its posture was commanding, as if it were asserting its dominance. Emma's hand instinctively reached out for John, and he squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. They both stood still, watching the falcon closely. But then something unexpected happened. The falcon didn't seem to be trying to attack. Instead, it tilted its head, almost curiously, as if examining them. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the falcon took off into the sky, its wings beating with surprising strength. I think it's trying to tell us something, John said, his voice low but steady. We need to be careful. As they made their way back to the house, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer dealing with just an ordinary wildlife problem. This was something far more complex. The metal transmitter they had found seemed to confirm that suspicion. Someone or something had been manipulating the birds, and that knowledge stirred a deep unease in Emma's chest. Later that afternoon, as the couple tried to process what had happened, a familiar face showed up at their door. It was the trainee, the one who had bungled the diagnosis with the cow. He stood awkwardly on the porch, hands in his pockets, looking as if he wasn't sure whether to be embarrassed or apologetic. John's eyes narrowed as he stepped outside. What brings you back here? The trainee cleared his throat, shifting from foot to foot. I wanted to see how you've been doing with the advice I gave you. I've been doing some more research into the falcons. Emma's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, research? Well, it turns out that this kind of thing, this behavior with the falcons, it's not natural. The trainee began, his voice cautious. I didn't mention it before, but there's been some new studies on falcon migrations. Some researchers have been trying to track them using special devices, like the one you found. Emma and John exchanged a look, a deep sense of dread settling over them. The trainee's words were like a heavy weight on their shoulders. So, you knew about this? John asked, his voice barely more than a growl. The trainee shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know what was happening to your farm, but I think there's something larger going on. These birds aren't acting on their own. They've been manipulated, tracked, possibly even used for some kind of experiment. Intriguing ending. The trainee's words hung in the air, and Emma felt a chill run down her spine. But who would do something like this? She asked, her voice trembling. The trainee's eyes darkened. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Chapter 10. A New Beginning. The months that followed the discovery of the falcon's hidden transmitter were filled with quiet determination. John and Emma had spent their lives building a home on their farm, tending to the animals and weathering every storm, both literal and figurative. But the events of the past year, pushed to the brink by falcon attacks, a botched veterinary visit, and strange occurrences beyond their control, had changed them. They were no longer the same couple who had lived their days in peaceful routine. Something deep inside them stirred, a yearning for change. "I think it's time, Emma," John said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. The golden light bathed the landscape in warmth, but his words were laden with the weight of uncertainty. "We've put so much into this farm, but maybe it's time for us to move on, take a step back. What do you think?" Emma, looking out at the horizon, understood. The farm had given them everything they needed for so long, but now it seemed to have taken more than it could offer. Their lives had been caught up in the drama of the Falcons, the illnesses, and the constant cycle of survival. She nodded slowly, a bittersweet feeling tugging at her heart. "I've been thinking the same thing," she said softly. "Maybe it's time to explore something new. We've earned the right to rest a little, don't you think?" So, after much deliberation, the couple made the difficult decision to leave their beloved farm. They weren't giving up. They were simply moving forward, making room for the next chapter of their lives. They made arrangements to sell the farm, and as they prepared to leave, the animals that had been their loyal companions were placed in the care of the local community. The new owners would continue the work they had started, but Emma and John were ready to embark on a different journey. The departure was emotional. Saying goodbye to the animals, especially the cows who had become so familiar, was harder than they had expected. But deep down, they knew they had done everything they could for the farm. Now, they could focus on other dreams they had put aside for years. In the following months, life on the farm returned to a semblance of normalcy, though not quite in the way they had anticipated. The Falcons no longer posed a threat, their mysterious manipulations seemingly a thing of the past. The skies above the farm grew calm again, as though the natural order had been restored. The community around the farm had found its rhythm, the wildlife had stabilized, and things began to settle into a peaceful, predictable pattern. But even in this quiet peace, there was something new on the horizon. A neighbor, someone Emma and John had never met, moved into the property next door. At first, they kept to themselves, but eventually, curiosity got the better of Emma. One afternoon, she baked a fresh loaf of bread and walked over to introduce herself. The new neighbor, a woman named Alice, was warm and welcoming. She seemed to have an energy that was both soothing and invigorating, a stark contrast to the years of quiet solitude Emma and John had enjoyed. "Welcome to the area," Emma said, offering the bread with a smile. "I hope you're settling in okay." Alice's eyes lit up at the gift. "Thank you. It's been a long journey, but this place, it's just what I needed." As they talked, Emma learned that Alice was also passionate about farming and wildlife. She had heard about the troubles Emma and John had faced with the Falcons, and she was eager to help in any way she could. Over time, the two women grew closer, and Emma felt a new connection forming. A new bond in a chapter of her life she hadn't expected. Back at their own home, John and Emma began a new project, a small garden by the house. It wasn't a large-scale farm like before, but it was enough to bring them joy. The garden flourished with vibrant vegetables, herbs, and flowers, their rich colors adding life to the little cottage where they now lived. Each morning, they worked together in the soil, planting, tending, and harvesting what they needed. It was simpler, quieter, but it brought them a contentment they hadn't known they were missing. The season's harvest was bountiful, far more than they had expected. Their small garden yielded an abundance of vegetables, and they had enough to share with Alice, who was eager to learn new gardening techniques. Emma felt a sense of pride in this humble victory, knowing that, despite everything, they had succeeded in nurturing something new. A new phase of their lives had begun, full of promise. Then came the final rescue, one last mission to make sure that all the animals Emma and John had once cared for were safe and well. The farm's new owners had called on them for help with a few stubborn goats that needed to be relocated to a different pasture. John and Emma, without hesitation, returned to the farm one final time to help. The goats were just as playful and spirited as they had been all those years ago. Emma couldn't help but smile as she led them to the new field, remembering the moments of joy they had shared with the animals. As she watched the goats graze happily in their new home, Emma knew it was time to say goodbye for good. With everything settled and the animals in good hands, John and Emma returned to their cottage, their hearts light with satisfaction. They had done everything they set out to do, protected the animals, cared for the land, and now they were ready to embrace their future. It wasn't the future they had once imagined, but it was theirs, and for the first time in years, they felt that it held something bright and full of promise. Intriguing ending. As they sat together, sipping tea on their porch, Emma looked at John and smiled. Do you think we'll ever know exactly what happened with those falcons? Who sent them? Why? John took a deep breath, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Maybe we'll never know, but what's important now is that we've found our peace. Emma nodded, content, but a part of her still wondered. What exactly did the future hold for them now? And would the mysteries of the past continue to follow them, even in their new life?